Thank you. Welcome to Two Households, Both Alike in Dignity, a not-so-tragedy of refactoring front-end APIs by me, Julia Nguyen. I'm also Flowchild on Twitter. So a bit about me. I'm a developer at Indiegogo. I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, currently living in San Francisco. I founded IFME. IFME is an open source mental health communication app. You can contribute to any capacity and join us. We're an awesome, really inclusive community, and we're always looking for contributors. I'm also part of Prompt. We're a community of people in tech who speak openly about mental health, which is really awesome and really important. And if you've seen any of my talks before, I talk a lot about that and also IFME, but today's talk is not about that. And lastly, I am one of the organizers at Write Speak Code San Francisco, and I help to get women and non-binary people into technical leadership through conference speaking, writing, and open source contributions. So let's begin. So I'm going to be telling this story through the lens, GIFs, of Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet. And like, who doesn't love 90s throwbacks, right? Like, it's super cool now. Everyone's wearing chokers and like crop tops and 90s. And also pre-Oscar, young cheekbones, Leonardo DiCaprio. Like, who doesn't love that? And on top of that, Baz Luhrmann, like, all of his movies are just over the top and intense, and this is going to be good. So I'm going to start off at the prologue. So at Indiegogo, I'm on the backer experience team, experience and trust team. And what is a backer? A backer is someone who gives money to a campaign. And yeah, a backer is someone who gives money to a campaign. And our tech stack actually is, on the back end, it's Ruby on Rails, and then on the front end, it's Angular 1. I know we should upgrade to a newer version of Angular, but we're actually looking into that. And recently, we decided to adopt TypeScript, which has been really interesting. And when people think of Indiegogo, they think of crowdfunding, they think of Kickstarter, they think of GoFundMe. All of those websites are in the same category of crowdfunding, but Indiegogo is actually a lot more than crowdfunding. It's a platform for entrepreneurs to create products and also fulfill them. And also shout out to our new product marketplace where you can actually buy products. Anyways, back to crowdfunding though. So when people think of crowdfunding, they think of perks. So you go to a campaign page, you give money, and then in exchange you get the perk, and it's usually the product that they're trying to sell and fulfill. And a perk actually is a reward that you get for contributing to a campaign. And essentially, it is a product. And products come in different configurations. Like, for instance, with this example, this campaign has a perk of a random t-shirt. And when we think of a perk in the context of a product, we think about items and options. We think about, oh, like, what size does this t-shirt come in? Does it come in different colors? What designs are there? And this was a site, like, in the past where whenever you wanted to make a t-shirt and have it as a perk, you'd have to create a perk for every single different configuration. You'd have like a black t-shirt in size small and like a white t-shirt in size large, and it just got really complicated. And Indiegogo, we're moving more towards product and creating a marketplace where people can buy awesome products, and it's important as part of e-commerce to have like itemization. And another problem that our engineering team at Indiegogo is trying to solve is payments. So people want their perks or products right away. Like, you want to buy it right away. You're excited about the product, and you want to receive it. You want the shipping to work out and all of that jazz. And what's more irritating than spending more than 2 minutes filling out your credit card information? It sucks. So this brings us to Act 1, as the awesome hip-hop group Wu-Tang Clan puts it, cream, or cash rules everything around me. Dollar dollar bills, y'all. Anyways, so let's begin. In Fair Verona, we have two households, both alike in dignity. But what does this actually mean in the context of this talk? So almost a year ago, two engineering teams were tasked with solving this perk and payment problem. The first team, I'll call them the Capulets, were tasked with integrating items and options for perks. So back to the example I said about having t-shirts of different sizes and different configurations. That's what itemization is. And the second team, the Montagues, were tasked with making payments go faster. So we decided to go with Apple Pay over Android Pay, first because we already had Apple Pay set up on our iOS app, and also through our user research, we found out that more users actually use iOS and Mac than any other platform on our website. So these two projects had a lot of overlap, and as everyone in this room is well aware of, software moves really fast, and so we had to work on these two projects in parallel, even though there was a lot of overlap. And often you don't realize that technical debt is accrued much later. And at the beginning, everything seems whimsical and romantic, this gift, it's hella cute, but it's not, because, technical debt hits you at the end. So a month later, we wrapped up these two projects, and they were being worked on in parallel. And I was tasked with adding Apple Pay support to items and options, and basically tying those two worlds, those two households together. And as I said before, these projects had a lot of overlap, and we worked on it in parallel. And I discovered a lot of the technical debt, and this is what the talk will be mainly about. So this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to tie in Apple Pay with items and options. There it goes. We're getting poison and fairy dust. Yeah. So from the front-end side of things, these two projects wrote their own services and their own directives for capturing the selected perk and displaying it in modals. And even though these two things touch the same object, the two teams wrote their own services and directives, which was problematic. And so at the beginning of the project, I went through all of this code and tried to figure out where there was overlap and where there was repetition. And I documented this so I could keep track of what we needed to do and what needed to be refactored. And I also pointed them so I could figure out the complexity of work that was required to do it. And the most egregious technical debt was that we had a lot of duplicate client-side code for the APIs for the perks, hence star-crossed perks. Oh, hey, this is Tybalt. So he's Juliet's cousin, who is all about fighting the Montagues, and Romeo specifically. So back to perks. So all of the perks, actually. So these are all of the front-end APIs for the same thing. And highlighted in the green highlighting text thingamabob is the repetition and the differences between them. So what's even more confusing is that the Montagues stuck with shipping address required, but the Capulets renamed it to shipping required, and they did the same thing. And then we also had like the shipping object, this also had fees, and then the other team, the Capulets, had shipping underscore fees. So that's an example of where there was overlap, but also like renaming of things. So the only reason why I identified this problem was because when I was working on getting Apple Pay to work with items and options, it wouldn't work when there was shipping available. Like the app just kept crashing, and I was just like debugging for days and like thinking to myself, like, what the hell is happening? And this is when I discovered that we had like different typings. This is TypeScript, and this was the cause of the problem. And it's something that's really hard to, I guess, identify, especially because TypeScript runs at compile time rather than runtime. But moving on, it's not as bad as waiting 20 years to win an Oscar, though. So, yay! So we made it to Act 4. This is when our star-crossed lovers marry each other, and the last bit of romance until shit hits the fan. So let's marry these perks together into one perk to rule them all. So getting to my feature work, I actually had to tackle this as, I actually had to work on this in order to move on and actually get Apple Pay working. And that was kind of hard to do because from the product side of things, our PMs were really pressing for deadlines to get this out because, cash rules everything around me, like we need to make money. So a lot of work actually had to go into just talking to the project managers. Some of them weren't technical about how dealing with technical debt and dealing with refactors is actually a really important part of engineering and also part of product. So yeah, let's get down to business. So we're going to start from the server side. So although this problem was in the front-end API, I needed to start from the bottom. So in our backend, which is Rails, like I said before, we had this model called perk. And we used serializers to expose specific attributes from controllers, and from that, we built the front-end API. So inspecting the serializer being used for items and options, I noticed this class called resource, and I was like, hold up, what is this? Is this like some Rails magic that I don't know about? But actually, it was a class that one of my old coworkers had created, and it inherited from something called a simple delegator, which is actually a Rails class. And just going through the resource code, I inferred that this was a class that contains logic for dealing with attributes, so you don't have to duplicate logic between serializers. And I did more research on simple delegators, and that's what it essentially was. So yeah, like I said before, it's a simple delegator. It's a Ruby class. And I did more digging, and I realized that it actually implements the decorator pattern, which I am aware of. So yay, software engineering design patterns. And basically, a decorator pattern allows for unique behavior to be added to an object without affecting other objects of the same class. So we had two serializers, one for the Montagues and one for the Capulets, so one for items and options and one just for regular perks. And the left was for the regular perk, and the right was for a perk with items and options. So this file called commerce perk_serializer used the decorator pattern through a simple delegator called the resource, so the previous slide I showed you. And then to the right, that serializer actually just put all of the logic for querying data into the serializer. And both serializers actually have the shipping fees method. So that was an example of duplication that could be consolidated together. So given the time constraints of the project and needing to deliver the feature by the end of the month, and also not wanting to get blocked by refactoring, I didn't get a chance to combine all of the perk serializers together, unfortunately. So I ended up creating something called a base perk serializer, which was the parent of the two serializers, and those serializers would inherit from them. And this serializer would use the decorator pattern, which I talked about earlier, and it could be shared between the two child serializers. So yay, problem solved, but not so quick. So going back to the client side of things, I had to clean up the mess that was in the client side, as I showed before, the issues with the repetitive typings. And in case anyone needs any refreshing or doesn't know the terms in Angular, a module is a directory that contains directives, services, and view templates that you can inject into other modules. This is an example of reusability. And services are ways to communicate between controllers, and they're also wrappers for APIs. And directives are used for building views and widgets, and it's also a place for DOM manipulation and dealing with events. So this led to actually creating a file called js/client, and this was a place for the code base in general, just to store services that made API calls. So our architecture, how it works in the front end, is that we have different modules for different features on the site, for instance, perk, campaign, product, et cetera. And we just put all of the directives and services and all this logic in this module. And what was interesting was that we would make the same API calls in lots of places, and we decided to put it in one place because it's nice to have a place where instead of copying the code for a service, you could just use that service to make the API call. So I ended up doing that. I created a folder and put perk in there. And since then, people have put other calls to the API client, like campaign and product. And as a result, now each module is a service. Rather than importing a full component to make an API call, you can just import the service. And this is definitely better than having to import an entire module with irrelevant code just to do one API call. So yay, success. So back to the star-crossed perks. So we just needed one perk to rule them all. And so since we were working in TypeScript, I had to make sure the typings were also consolidated. So I created this one perk typing, and then also created one related typings like perk items, and I put it in one place. Because in the past, it was just scattered around the code base, and it was just really hard to deal with. And usually if people couldn't find the original typing, they would just make a new one. And there would just be all this duplicate and also renaming of things. And then on top of that, I also had to settle on attributes and remove duplication. So I ended up choosing, earlier on, I talked about how there were shipping underscore fees and also shipping dot fees. So I decided to go with shipping underscore fees because it's actually, shipping underscore fees is an attribute in the model. So basically, when you're building APIs, you want to have consistent attribute names from the back end to the front end, instead of renaming it and doing all this weird JSON magic with it. So I ended up doing that, and removing duplication was great. And it also reduced line numbers. And on top of that, I converted the factory into TypeScript. So yeah, now all the perks are one perk to rule them all. And it was a really good fake death. And a few of these perks died, but they became one. Hurrah! Yay, so we've reached our final act, postmortem. So as you all are all familiar with Romeo and Juliet, Claire Danes, Juliet, fakes her death so that young 90s Leo DiCaprio, Romeo, is devastated. She doesn't do that so he can get devastated, but she dies because she thinks he's dead. Anyways, at the end, they just all die, and it's very tragic and sad. And even though, this is kind of an analogy too, like even though we did all this great work, refactoring, cleaning up the technical debt, it's not over. We need to implement a best practice moving forward. So we've dealt with technical debt in some shape or we've all dealt with technical debt in some shape or form. And as much as we don't want to accrue technical debt, it just happens. It's just natural. It's part of software development. And obviously, and in most cases, it's not malicious. Like no one goes in there and goes, I'm going to ruin code so that like the other person gets screwed over. No one wants people to suffer. And also on top of that, like I mentioned, talking about the project I worked on, there are tight deadlines, projects are running in parallel, and like sometimes you just don't have the time to sit down and like actually write clean code. And that being said, it doesn't mean we shouldn't have addressing technical debt as part of our engineering standards. Like we should talk about it. It should be part of our best practices. And like a metaphor I like to think about is taking out a student loan, for instance, where a student loan is kind of like technical debt. Realistically, you can't pay it all off in one sweep. You have to pay it off incrementally. So this is where the idea of tackling debt as you go comes, just doing it in small increments so that at the end you end up with cleaner code without overwhelming yourself and also perhaps extending deadlines. And then another thing I want to talk about is that like refactoring is hard. You often go down this rabbit hole where you're like, I can fix this, and then it just keeps going, and then you don't make commits for it, and you have to like reset it, and it's just a disaster. And realistically, you can't refactor everything, sad face. But you can pick and choose your battles, and you can choose to refactor stuff. And what I did was I documented things that needed to be refactored, and it's really useful for the next person who works on the project or touches the code base, and even for myself in the future, because past Julia might not remember like all of these issues. So it's really important to document things. And then just here are some general tips on like addressing technical debt and refactoring. It's better to investigate technical debt at the beginning of a project than discover it later. So it'd be really awesome. It would be really awesome for more teams to like actually spend time at the beginning going through the code base and like identifying potential issues. And then I think it's also really advantageous to account for debt when you're sprint planning and also integrate it in the pull request process. Like when you're reviewing other person's code, ask them, is this an opportunity for you to clean up this code, or like how can we make this code cleaner? And then on top of that, when we speak about technical debt, it's a very like engineering thing, but it's really involved. It's really important to get your PM involved in the process because engineering isn't just developers, and software development isn't just developers. It's an entire process full of different people. And then personally for me, like it was just really helpful to ask lots of questions from the other developers on the team who had touched the code previously. And on top of that, like people's skills are important. And then, like I said in the previous slide, you can't refactor everything. So it's important to, do it incrementally and just tackle it slowly, just kind of like paying off student debt. And in the end, it's just, nicer for your mental health, and you do end up with cleaner code. And here are some useful resources that really helped me refactor technical debt in this project. If you don't know who Sandy Metz is, oh my God, you should prepare yourself because she's amazing, and just prepare to be enlightened. And then also check out Don't Reset Hard. This is a talk given from my awesome coworker, Sienna Aguayo. Here she talks about it in the context of Android, but everything she talks about is applicable to different web technologies and even mobile technologies. And then the last two resources are by Victoria Kotsarenko and Eric Elliott. These were specifically really useful for Rails and JS specific resources. And then also, I want to give a shout out to Judy. Judy was my manager on the team I was on, and like she actually encouraged me to like give this talk. So thank you, Judy. But yeah, since I love metaphors and analogies, there was a lot of technical debt between Romeo and Juliet. The Montague-Capulet beef, and it's interesting to think about because, like, particularly with their story, like drama, makes things more exciting and you learn more. And maybe technical debt is good. It's inevitable, and we all have to deal with it, and we all come out as stronger and more patient developers when we tackle it. And something like I thought about was, maybe the drama made their relationship. Like maybe technical debt is okay, and like it makes things interesting. And if you do know Romeo and Juliet, you know Mercutio. So he's played by the actor Henry Perrineau. And what's really interesting about his character was that he was neither a Capulet or a Montague. He was neutral. And going back to like technical debt, dealing with technical debt is a very stressful process, and you want to play the blame game. You want to get blame and be like, this person did that. But when you think about it, like ultimately, it isn't about laying blame and like blaming someone to do it. You have to clean it up yourself. So ultimately, everyone benefits when you take the effort to improve code. So let's tackle technical debt like we're Mercutio, and it's 1996. But really, it's 2017 because we've come a longer way. So thank you for listening. Any questions? Has anyone seen this movie? It has a really great soundtrack, Anyways.
When you were going about unifying the code, did they actually behave the same? Because one of the things that I might have expected in that situation, that subtly the teams might have introduced different bugs or different behaviors by accidentally having different mini code bases.
Yeah, and that was something like I was really worried about because there were like two distinctive features and I didn't want to break anything, but I worked very slowly in trying to like refactor things incrementally, and then also did a lot of manual testing like between refactors. So I found that helped as well. Hey, Judy.
What was the testing situation like?
Oh, so testing for Apple Pay is kind of painful. So I'm an Android user, so I've never really dabbled around a lot with iOS. And just setting up like the test environment for Apple was a pain, and also just like getting it to work. But it was a lot of manual testing, and for me, like I had to test from like beginning to end, meaning I had to test like getting a perk with like a certain items and options configuration, and then testing throughout the entire pay flow to make sure it worked. So that's another thing. Like even though I only touched like the perk selection, I had to make sure I tested that you could actually buy the item and you can actually fulfill it. So. Yeah.
Was there a lot of test consolidation also?
Definitely, yeah. There was a lot of like repetitive tests, so that was a very satisfying thing, like deleting tests that were repeated. Also, like when you do have a lot of tests, it like slows down your test suite, so it is nice to delete tests. So yeah.
You use a TypeScript, but how much code is everything typed at this stage? Or?
No, so we're kind of like tackling this as we go along, but basically every new file that we create in the code base, it has to be TypeScript and there has to be typings for it. But there have been opportunities where people have gone back and like converted files to TypeScript, but it's a long process, and we're even debating TypeScript at this point now too, because it's kind of given us some problems. But yeah. But in theory, like in principle, like types are beautiful and they're great. So.
What kind of problems are you encountering with TypeScript?
So right now I'm on the performance team, and we're working on like optimizing the page, optimizing load time for the page, and like the problems that we've come up with were like moving modules around and discovering that like the typings that were created don't actually match what's on the server side. Like with JSON, you can just put anything in any object, and that gets passed on to the server side. So that was a huge problem, just discovering that like the typings didn't actually match what was on the server side.
I have a question about your approach to refactoring. So in the past, I worked on a code base that was less than wonderful, shall we say. And one of the decisions that I had to make a lot was, like, say in a class or a module, there's a lot of stuff that's horrible, and there's some stuff that might be untested that's used all the time, and some stuff that's not used that much. And sometimes I found it difficult deciding on whether to clean up the stuff that's not used, because that's less risky. And it means when you go to the code the next time around, it doesn't hurt so much to try and figure out the horrible bit. Or you fix the horrible bit. What's your approach?
That's a good question. I don't know. Like, I feel like like refactoring is something that we all have to experience, but there's no like clear-cut instructions on how to do it. I think like cleaning up unused codes, for instance, is a really easy win, and it's also really satisfying. So I kind of tend to do that first, just for like psychological purposes. Like it's just nice to get rid of it, and then like getting rid of it also clears my mind, so I can just focus on like the hard bits that I actually have to like refactor and like write tests for. So yeah, I guess it kind of depends on your situation and like how much patience you have. Yeah.
So like, we always have problems on whether technical depth should be considered part of feature work or it should be done as a separate activity, like basically lowering the velocity of the team for the following iterations and like, you know, doing it in a separate way. So I'm not sure if you have.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess traditionally, or like most people kind of see technical or dealing with technical debt as like a one-off, like something that you do at the very end to clean up. And I think when you think that way, technical debt becomes less important, and you actually accrue more technical debt and just like waiting it. And kind of like the metaphor I said with like student loans, I think that we should tackle it from the beginning. So like our teams at Indiegogo, for instance, we've like put it as part of our engineering process, like time to like think about technical debt and like time to refactor. And it's really hard sometimes to convince like product managers why it's important, because it's something that's not tangible that you can't quite see. Sometimes it actually is though, because like performance-wise, for instance, but I think just like making time to like explain this to non-engineers is really important, because technical debt like should be addressed at the beginning, right? So, yeah.
Like the thing is, how many moments do you identify that you say this is an enabler for the feature, or do you just?
Yeah, like for instance, like what I was working on, like I had to like refactor because it was affecting shipping, and if I didn't do it, then like people couldn't buy perks with shipping. So something like that, like being able to identify like the technical debt you're working on and like how it maps to the actual feature is also really important. So I think like the engineer has a responsibility to be able to identify that and communicate it to their PMs.
Do you have any recommendations for explaining the cost of the debt to PM?
I guess just like what I was working on, it was more straightforward. It was like, yeah, we just like people can't buy this if this doesn't work. But sometimes it's like more trickier. So you kind of have to pick and choose your battles. And I think, for instance, like writing out like the different parts of the technical debt into like smaller stories helps, and being able to point them. Like PMs really like to think in terms of points and things like that. So yeah, I think organizing it and like instead of just saying, oh, this giant thing has this one problem, identify it in smaller pieces, and hopefully that'll be easier for a PM to understand. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for coming to my talk, and go watch Romeo and Juliet.